Okay, everybody, welcome back. So we're ready to move on to our second panel, which will be moderated by Scott Nessler. Scott joined the Mendoza College of Business as an associate teaching professor following his retirement from the U.S. Army after more than 25 years of service. Most recently, he was the Force Strategy Division Chief at the Center for Army Analysis. Scott's work in analytics spans a bunch of different areas, from sports analytics to financial and project portfolio analysis, and he also focuses on data ethics. Scott, thanks for being here and for agreeing to moderate our second panel. I'll throw it over to you to introduce the panelists. Scott, can you hear me? Scott? I don't know if, can you hear me now, Scott?
Yes.
Okay, over to you, Scott. Go ahead and you can introduce.
All right, hello everyone. My name's Scott Nessler. Our second panel here today is going to build on what we heard in the first panel and the keynote. You know, the previous panel talked about what bias is and how it comes about and ways that it manifests. We're going to push a little more into the so what questions. I'd like to do a brief introduction of the panel members. I have a colleague from Notre Dame here, Kirsten Martin, Mutali Nkande, who is a fellow here at Notre Dame, Francesca Rossi from IBM, Kate Brittenberg from the London School of Economics, and Michael Zimmer from Marquette University. So I would like to give each of them a few minutes to give a brief introduction of themselves, their thoughts regarding algorithmic bias, and where the work that they do fits into this domain. Kirsten, can you lead us off, please?
Sure. Thank you very much, Scott. So I'm in a business school. I'm in Mendoza School of Business, and I study the ethics of technology within a business school. So what I normally am looking at is what are the harms from the technology, whether it be privacy issues or fairness or dignity harms or algorithmic bias. In what way are they harmful, or what is the wrong of what's going on? How can I justify this in a normative way? But then I also have to argue, what is business responsible for? What part of this harm is business responsible for, at what point, and what should they be doing differently? And so it's that last part that is the burden of being in the business school, is being pretty specific within the theories that I have within the business school, is to argue what should business be doing right and what should they be stopping doing for the future.
Great, thank you. Mutali, can you introduce yourself and provide a little context of your background?
Yes, thank you for this kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with great people. And one of my favorites, of course, Cathy O'Neill, who really is linked to the work that I do in this sector. So I work at the intersection of race and technology. And I'm specifically interested in policy. So I always say that I feel that policy, whether it be legislative or whether it be the way a business works, that uses technologies, particularly AI, their ideology is really is really delivered through the way that they yield that technology. So I was involved in the introduction of the Algorithmic Accountability Act, where I was really interested in impact assessment as something that the federal government should be thinking about. The same with deepfakes, so labeling of false data, which I'm really glad that we've seen some of in this election cycle, even though I would argue that we shouldn't be at the mercy of business to deliver these services. And then obviously No Biometric Barriers Housing Act, where we were looking specifically at privacy and the racialized impact of surveillance on Black populations. And that really came through a conversation that Cathy O'Neill had very early when I was looking at this, and she had been at Brooklyn Law School talking about her book. We had connected, and then she'd actually gone to the Museum of Math. So her and I are big museum geeks here in New York, and she said we should have a data bill of rights. And I was actually working with a congresswoman here around what are we going to do about unbridled technologies. So I'm interested in architecture, but I'm also interested in policy, and also sit on the TikTok content moderation board. So looking at social media and some of the decisions that are made around what we see and what we don't see.
That's some fascinating work. Thank you. Francesca, your turn.
Yes, hi. So as you said, I work at IBM. I am part of research. So my background is in AI research. I've been doing that for many decades. But I think that I would like to focus on, for this panel, on my role as related to AI ethics. So I co-chair the internal IBM AI ethics board, where of course AI algorithmic bias is a very a focus area. And so to me, I mean, it's very important, to for the board to understand how to really operationalize within a company, in my case, IBM, but any other company, how to operationalize the principles around and the understanding and the framing around AI bias in a way that handling AI bias in the best way, also, in consultation with the external communities, becomes an integral part of what developers do, and is not like an add-on or something that is not considered necessary. So the AI at this board does a lot of work, starting from culture changing, educational material, because of course developers need to be helped in adopting new methodologies or new processes within their everyday pipeline. And another aspect, of course, is to help not just the developers, but also the business units that propose some offerings to the clients to understand whether those offerings are acceptable or not. And the board, we put in place a board that has the power to say, no, this is not acceptable, because of course that's very important. We learned many lessons all the way, and that's very important that the board has that power inside the company.
It's great to hear the application out in practice of some of these things we've been talking about from your background. Kate, can you share some thoughts with us and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kate Brittenberg, philosopher and assistant professor at the London School of Economics. So as a philosopher, my interest in this kind of field of bias and technology more broadly is, on the one hand, to think about how technology challenges our traditional moral notions and frameworks. So for example, something that Solon Barokas has worked on, who was on the last panel, is whether AI, for example, might challenge our concept of what discrimination is, and particularly kind of what wrongful discrimination is. And then on the other hand, I'm interested in bringing our kind of moral and political theories to bear to kind of look at what's happening in society around technology and diagnose what's going wrong and what, say, companies ought to do about it, as well as governments. So for example, there's a kind of classic debate in political philosophy about whether there's, on the one hand, a big camp thinks there's a kind of moral division of labor between governments and companies. It's really governments that ought to be regulating and making decisions about, say, issues of fairness and bias. And it's kind of up to companies to support them, but not to kind of go out on a moral limb and make their own decisions. And this you actually see, interestingly, kind of at the core of human rights law as well. On the other hand, a lot of people have argued in societies like ours, where there's a real kind of deep moral failure of governments, or just not to presume that our society is like that. In societies where there are deep moral failures of governments, then perhaps, private actors or other kind of actors might have an obligation to kind of take on additional moral obligations and do the right thing, even in a kind of somewhat adversarial way against government. So those are two examples of how I think both issues about bias kind of challenge our kind of current conceptions of the obligations of ethical stakeholders, and how we can use kind of philosophy to think about these questions.
Great, thank you. And to round us out, we have Michael Zimmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Zimmer, and I'm an associate professor of computer science at Marquette University. And I think my contribution to the discussion today comes a little bit in part of the unique positioning that I have right now in computer science, because I'm not a computer scientist, but I'm hired by a department to bring a focus on data ethics, to bring more conceptual, theoretical, and even social science perspectives into how we address these issues related to bias and AI, and all the data-based kind of technologies that we're training our students to go out and build. So some of the things that I think I'd like to talk more about today is is the strategies we're using on how to train our students to address these issues, to recognize these issues when we send them out into the world. But then also other stakeholders, both working with technologists and how do we engage with companies and people developing these platforms, but also an increased focus on users and how do users even understand bias? How do they relate to how biases? How do we understand how different user communities might be impacted differently based on how we might think we're solving bias? So I think doing that kind of a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder kind of approach can help us work through some of these problems as well.
All right, thank you. We've got a few questions for each of the panelists. I'm going to start with the first question going to Kate, and that is, what ethical obligations do developers or institutions have in accounting for bias in algorithmic decision making?
Yeah, I get the hardest question to start. So I kind of outlined two camps earlier. One, it's kind of primarily the job of governments, or two, perhaps private sector actors ought to lead. I tend to fall in the camp of it's primarily the job of governments, and indeed we ought to be more kind of heavily regulating and intervening with some of the kind of foundational norms that technologists are using to make these kind of decisions. And that's, I think, for a few reasons, and also has a major downside. On the one hand, you end up with more legitimate decisions. So here by legitimate, I mean, we generally think it's wrong to kind of impose some cost or coercive policy on people who haven't consented to it. So the reason we think the US government is perhaps okay punishing us or taking certain, taxing us, doing things like that, is we all have the opportunity to vote. We have, broadly a functioning electoral system. And so in virtue of that, it's kind of fair the government that does this. You might think, very powerful technology actors don't have that same kind of legitimacy. So it's not fair for them to be taking, or it's not right for them to be taking these high stakes decisions. Governments are also tend to be kind of more predictable. I might trust that Microsoft is doing the same thing today, the kind of right thing today, but will do the same or the right thing tomorrow. That, though, can have a kind of real cost that I mentioned in cases where we think governments are not sufficiently addressing bias, and in cases where we think they're kind of systemic governmental failings. Still, I would say that the kind of task of, say a kind of private actor like a powerful company is perhaps not first and foremost to go out on a moral limb, but to go to Michael's point about kind of bringing in multi-stakeholders, thinking, are there kind of, groups and processes by which I can make these decisions more legitimate, bring more people to the table, and kind of strengthen what government is doing, perhaps by supporting kind of grassroots organizing or other efforts.
All right, thank you. Maybe next we'll jump to someone who's either in business or in a business school. Francesca or Kirsten, any thoughts on this question regarding ethical obligations?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, of course, there are many actors that should share responsibilities. But I think that there is a role, I mean, to follow up on what was said already, there is a role for definitely multi-stakeholder initiatives to achieve consensus, wide as possible, on what are the best practices, for example, and to be open about these best practices. So I mean, I have experience, for example, of some of these initiatives, like the Partnership on AI that puts together companies, UN agencies, civil society organizations, and academia, or even some UN initiatives, or even the recently started the Global Partnership on AI, where 15 countries, including the US, Europe, and about 15 others, are trying to understand, how to achieve really a global consensus, as well as many standard initiatives that are currently not being deliberated, but they are working on standards related, for example, also to best practices, definitions, notions of bias, and so on, like the IEEE P7000 series of standards. So to me, there is this idea of really multi-stakeholder organization. From the point of view of a single company, like IBM can be, and that's the one that I'm most familiar with, yeah, there is an obligation, and I feel it very to join these consensual and multi-stakeholder things. So that's why we participate in so many of them, because I think that we need to learn together with others what are the best practices. We need to compare. For example, I mentioned one way that the IBM has to operationalize, these general principles. But that can be specific to a company. Other company can have a different one. So it's good to compare and to tell lessons learned, even challenges that have been, addressed during this path in trying to operationalize. So that's what I think that companies should do. Be open about the challenges, the path that they have been following in order to make AI bias, for example, detection and mitigation integral part of their processes. And then on top of that, I think there is an obligation of being transparent. So that's why we have this, we try to take everything that we give to our clients, and we give much more information than just the intended use and the accuracy, for example, but also what we did, for example, to address bias detection and mitigation, what definition of fairness we considered appropriate for that scenario, and what actually we did to try to avoid bias in the data, in the other decisions of the development process, and so on. So transparency about these decisions, because if you're not transparent, then whoever is going to use that AI system cannot even understand what's the appropriate or non-appropriate use for that system. So that's very important. And the other thing that was mentioned is education. Of course, for students is very important, but education is also very important for people that are producing already. They're not students anymore and are producing these systems. So they need to be educated and be possibly retrained, because like in my case, IBM is not a new company, so it's not that we are hiring young people now to deal with bias. We have existing developers, so they need to be made, trained to understand what it means to take care of AI bias in their, operations. And also we try as much as possible to build these diverse teams, so that in the team there can be people with different background, different point of views that can make the other team members aware of their respective biases, because that's also something that comes into play. The bias we are full of biases, and if we are not aware, we inject these biases there. So there are all sorts of obligation, I would say, that a private company should put in place in order to make sure that what goes out of the company has the right properties. But it cannot be done, I would like to stress, it cannot be done only by talking inside the company, only around AI experts. It has to be done with all the other stakeholders.
All right, thank you. Kirsten, looks like you follow up there.
Yeah, sure. So the question was about who's responsible, like is business or is it government responsible for algorithmic bias? I would say, I think we should be wary as to how this is answered. So for example, if Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook argues that this should be the responsibility of government, there's a reason for that. And the reason is it allows businesses to go pretty much to do whatever they want. They will figure out a way around whatever regulation that you have and make smaller decisions that are not noticed. And so I think, and also he would know the United States, and there's no way we're going to have any government regulation on algorithmic bias. I mean, that's just not going to happen in the United States. We can't even do it around privacy. So I think that there needs to be more of a discussion around the responsibility of business. And the way I would phrase it is that, similar to the way Francesca just mentioned around IBM, is that if you decide to make an algorithmic decision inscrutable, difficult to understand, black box it, however we want to call it, But then the developer is then taking responsibility for all the problems, good or bad, that come out of that algorithmic decision. Because he's saying, or she, don't worry, I'm going to make it so that I'm going to govern this decision because I'm not letting anyone else do the governing of this decision. And so I'm going to be responsible for it. If they want to make it so that the users are actually responsible for that decision and governing it, making sure that there isn't any bias, fixing any mistakes, making sure the mistakes aren't biased in some way, then they need to make it more open and transparent, make it so that it can be understandable. That might mean that it's less, I'll put in quotes, accurate, so it might be a more simplistic model that they're using for a computer program augmented decision. But then they could actually allow people to take responsibility, like all business decisions. All business decisions are augmented with technology in some way, whether it's a calculator or a spreadsheet. This is just a little bit fancier. And so we don't, thinking that every algorithmic decision in a business is going to be somehow governed would allow a lot of small decisions that are made with algorithms in the business go ungoverned, if that makes sense. We can't focus everything on the government to do it. And I would also say this discussion where businesses argue that they can't do it, it's not their job, how are they supposed to know? We had this discussion around smoking, pollution, car safety, financial markets. I mean, business makes this argument all the time. Every time there's a new technology, they argue that they can't be held responsible for the bad parts of it. And we just have to wait it out, and then they have to end up taking responsibility for it, whether it's through the courts or something else. So I actually argue more that the business needs to be responsible because it's those design decisions that make such a difference, and it's really hard to regulate design for good reasons.
All right, thanks for sharing your perspective. I see that Mitali has come off of mute, and I know that you mentioned Zuckerberg, so I'm sure we'll hear from Michael. Mitali, why don't you continue the conversation?
I actually respectfully disagree, just because I think the bias is not the best framing for what we're speaking about. And certainly in my own work, I definitely push legislators to think about how these impact protected groups. So I would speak about automated anti-Blackness, for example, because we do have existing civil rights laws, as well as we have a whole human rights canon where we can look at disparate impact and then look at the ways that we can actually regulate this disparate impact. Because in my view, bias is this kind of catch-all term for things that might be bad, but we can't actually hold you accountable for. Whereas if we can hold you accountable for being in violation of existing laws. So for example, one of the things I'm looking at the moment is very much the way biometric technologies have been used in the context of protest, right? We've just come out of a summer. We're still in a season of protest in the United States for what I would consider very good reasons, but we do have the constitutional rights to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And so what do we do when the deployment systems, the deployment decisions that we make about a particular technology? I'm very famous for saying, in my view, technologies are agnostic. And while they do have embedded bias, which is a different discussion for the point I'm making right now, but also we need to look at deployment. And so because I tend to advise policymakers to think about real impacts and how those impacts are governed in other systems, I would argue that you can use those types of frameworks. And then beyond that, I do sit in international consultancy situations. I'm a key constituent for the 3C UN Table for AI. Sorry, lots of letters and long phrase. So if I've got it wrong, UN, email me. But the thing that I find is that the global South and other less medium-sized and poor countries do not have the same type of voice in those countries. Yet, companies like Amazon and Chinese companies, specifically in the African context, are creating these systems that they then deploy on foreign markets. So this idea that the Partnership for AI or some of the stakeholder groups that sit in the global North, I'm involved in some stakeholder consultations in London as well, has the real possibility of reproducing logics of colonialism. And in, Nick Cowdery writes very, very well on data colonialism. So I would also then look for existing local law or existing law in the local context that can be used to look at that. I would also argue that we shouldn't limit what government can do without community organizing. I very jokingly spoke to some changes that we're seeing in the U.S. context in regards to the election, but I do feel that if an educated citizenry decide that a particular protocol in terms of the way that AI is deployed, I'm thinking very specifically of Ring doorbells, right? If we decide to have the right to privacy to go to store and then not have our images sold to police systems, that's something that can be organized around, and once organized, pushed against. So while I do think that business does have a role and should have a role, I would have thought in the type of business that I would want to interact with should have a role. And I've written about this in the Harvard Business Review around social corporate responsibility and where some of these questions could potentially lie. I also think that governments that can be held accountable by people are an extremely powerful tool to do some of this work. And as we're transitioning in the US, there are discussions being had about what could another type of government with different ideology, where could that be pushed? Who else is in the field doing this work? So I definitely, while I respectfully, take what my colleagues on the business side have said, I don't think that full rescibility should sit there.
Thanks, Kathy.
Can I just clarify for just 1 second to clarify? I actually do agree that the existing laws are where the muscle is right now. So, the EPA with Volkswagen is a good example. We don't need, they didn't have to wait for an algorithmic accountability or an algorithmic harm type regulation. The EPA stepped in and said, you broke other laws that already exist. The same with employment laws, the same with marketing laws that we had, advertising laws, we have housing laws. I mean, there is a slew of laws, and these are algorithmically, helped decisions that are still business decisions, that they are still accountable to the laws already on the books. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done there without waiting for an algorithmic accountability regulation, whether or not that comes out around. So I'm just saying that there's work that business needs to do now to be responsible for the business decisions that they're making that already are regulated, if that makes sense. So, but that's a good clarification that the existing laws do a lot of work right now.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kirsten, for updating that. This is Kathy. I just wanted to basically say what Kirsten just said, that like we already have laws, and we're not, and there's lots of industries that are highly regulated, and somehow the algorithms aren't getting forced to comply with those laws, in large part, as I said in my keynote, because we haven't really defined exactly what it means to comply with the law, but we will. And then it's going to be, and I think the framing of the question's a little bit misleading. It's going to be a dance between businesses and government, where the government's going to say, hey, here's a rule. And the businesses are going to be like, oh, no, we can't possibly follow that rule. Here's an easier rule to follow. And that dance could be a fake dance where they don't actually comply with anything and they get away with everything, or it could be better. I mean, look at the SEC. The SEC had power in the 80s, and then it doesn't have power now. So you see that either way could work. And by the way, the SEC is another reason that's a great example, is because it is all of finance is algorithmic. So it's we have to do that in all other industries. So it's a very good model for what could go right, what could go wrong.
All right, thanks for jumping in there. Michael, your turn to give us your thoughts on this.
Well, it's hard to add much on this great conversation, but I wanted to pick up on something that Kirsten was talking about, and this idea that maybe to help make algorithms more explainable and therefore perhaps more auditable is to simplify, and then maybe scale back. And it reminds me of discussions I've had in the classroom about whether or not we need to create the equivalent of some kind of FDA process for algorithms, where an algorithm gets submitted, they test it on a sample, you make sure it doesn't kill people, you make sure it doesn't have adverse side effects, and that it actually does what you say it will do. And we test things a little bit before we just let Facebook or Instagram or someone just deploy an algorithm, and all of a sudden we have to just hope that things go well. And it connects to some of the issues that Francesca was mentioning in terms of training and getting the designers of these systems to recognize and understand these issues. And I'll share an example where I'm lucky to be working with a team of data scientists, and they're going through some machine learning to build an algorithm to help solve a really important public health problem. And they want to incorporate some data that their IRB says is fine to use. But these researchers are worried that there's some ethical complications with this data. And so I'm helping them work through this. And they've gone so far to say that, Michael, if you say this data is too problematic, and even if it helps our model, we're just not going to use it. And so how do we get more people to have that kind of sort of openness to understanding that maybe bigger isn't always better in terms of building algorithms and the type of data we're including, and to sort of have that kind of critically reflective moment where they're willing to scale things back. And I'm not sure how we can get there in a large scale, but that's just sort of where this conversation is starting to get me thinking.
All right, thanks very much. Thus far, we've been talking about ethical obligations and where they might lie. Let's turn it a little bit more towards the very applied, very practical. What sort of responses, be they technical, institutional, or legal, are best suited to dealing with the problems that we see related to algorithmic bias? We've touched on that a little bit here, but let's talk about how maybe the type of response or the class of response might be different depending on the domain, depending on the situation and the context. Mitali, would you like to kick us off here?
So I've spent a large part of my career working with lawyers, and it's not very usual that people will come on panels and say, get the lawyers involved, they'll know what to do. But I have found using kind of the hammer of the law, right, can be a really useful way of creating. And I see this specifically in content moderation work, which right now is really company by company. And they do have consultations, they do bring in experts, so this multi-stakeholder model that has been previously discussed. But ultimately, we're making suggestions, and ultimately the company is going to go off and do whatever it is. And one of the things that I really liked about, and Michael, it's so funny, I'm just writing right now about this FDA type idea for algorithmic systems, just because I don't know the explainability of algorithms is the key. Having worked with non-computational audiences, they don't actually care what's under the hood. What they actually care about is impact. So if there was a way to develop, and this is where I'm really interested in your work, Caitlin, from a philosophical point of view, if there's a way to make the idea explainable and then create common language that can be picked up by non-experts, so they basically know what they have. So, kind of like when you buy food, you might know how many calories is in it and fructose or whatever. Or when you ingest a medicine, I found that working with lawyers have been really, really, really helpful, specifically to the point that we made previously. If we can look at existing statute or existing ways of understanding what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in the local context, and then applying it. But I will say, to Kathy's point, that we do need to create political pressure to make sure that it reaches the algorithm, right? And what we did in 2019 under the previous administration with the Algorithmic Accountability Act is really enter what's called a messaging bill. So these are bills that are not meant to be passed into law. We did not have the politics to pass it into the law at that time. It was prior to the Democrats winning the House, but what it did was introduce this idea that there are algorithms in the world, number one. They do exist. Number two, you are using them. Number three, and these are potential impacts. And then really think about the interests of the interests of the stakeholder that we were trying to target. And much of my work sits within the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Caucus of Black Women and Girls, as well as Tech Accountability Caucus, AI Caucus, all the caucuses. But it's folks who are really interested in having what I would describe as a just technological sector. And we found that worked really well. We had briefings, there was press, people understood what we were trying to do, and it made it explainable for the lawyers. So what ended up happening with the Deepfakes Accountability Act, which really illustrates this idea of taking existing ideas and then applying it to a new technology, was we worked with Danielle Citron and Marianne Franks over at the Cyber Civil Law Initiative. And we framed users of social media technology as consumers, which invoked consumer rights, which then invoked the idea that you should have the right to know what you're looking at is real or not. So it was a kind of roundabout strategy. I don't think that lawyers need to be necessarily the only people in the conversation, but I think in a situation where you're trying to create new norms through the passage of law, that in a policy context, they're really, really important part of that picture.
Great, thank you. Since Natalie mentioned both Michael and Kate in her remarks, we'll go back to them for any thoughts or comments they have. Michael, you first.
No, thank you. And I'm still synthesizing a lot of our threads here that I think are working really well together. And I'm trying to draw comparisons on how do we deal with this and what's the right place to deal with AI ethics, and thinking about how more and more organizations are starting to introduce ethicists into their structures and having a chief ethics officer or whatever that might look like. But that's really messy. And it brings this challenge about how do you operationalize, or I guess, should you even be operationalizing ethics within an organizational decision-making process? Is that something best done within? Is it better done by some kind of a independent board on the outside? And I don't have the answer to that. I think that's what we need to start thinking about. I see a parallel in how 10 years ago, most companies didn't have a privacy officer, but now the vast majority do. Because a large regulatory regime was put in place, and all of a sudden these companies had to be in compliance. And so are we going to move in that direction where every tech company has a chief ethics officer? Perhaps, but then I fear that we just turn that into a regulatory function and not actually thinking, reflecting on ethics. It's just, how do I comply with whatever accountability act we've created, and whatever ethics that framing was prioritized when that bill was passed. And so there's this tension here, and I'm not sure how to figure it out. We all might be able to if we spend some time on it. But so I mean, Kate, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, lots of interesting threads to synthesize. So to pick up on a few things, I totally agree with Mittal, and I think it's kind of important to stress that transparency on its own, or transparency of a certain type, can just be a kind of smokescreen. Transparency often functions by saying to people, hey, look, we told you what's going on. And so, you can't have any complaints when you get a certain kind of outcome. But of course, what people often object to are the particular purpose or end to which the thing is put. And they think that is not fair, or they don't even kind of know what it is. And so to go back to an earlier point Kirsten made, kind of imagine if you had designers thinking, well, when I'm designing a particular piece of technology, I'm going to have to justify, I'm going to have to explain why this thing is good, it's just, it's fair to the people that it's being used with. I think that's a very different mindset, and that's very different from the kind of explainability or transparency as conceived in a lot of the computer science literature, which really kind of, maybe lets things kind of function with the status quo, but just adds a little bit more looking under the hood without kind of changing the ultimate end or purpose. And like Michael, I think I also worry about this function of a chief ethics officer, in part for compliance reasons, but also in part because I think, like if you look at Ruha Benjamin's work in her book, Race After Technology, that a lot of these problems are raised by the kind of intersection of racism and capitalism. And so just kind of merely putting an ethics officer into a company without thinking about how business incentives, or in the political sphere, how political incentives are going to shape how this function gets played, I think is going to kind of make it lose a lot of the critical force that you would hope it would have in the first place. So, it's really important to hire diverse teams, but if they don't have the kind of environment where the incentives encourage them to actually succeed in the critical work they want to do, then it's going to be kind of undermining ultimately, unfortunately.
Okay, we have a few minutes remaining. Kirsten, Francesca, any thoughts on the responses, whether they are technical, institutional, or legal, are best suited to deal with this problem?
Yeah, well, I wanted to, yeah, definitely. I mean, I just published yesterday a piece on the Harvard Business Review saying that technical solutions are necessary, but definitely are not the complete solution, because you also need many other mechanisms. So whether it's governance, methodologies, standards, many education that we mentioned already, retraining and so on. So technical solutions are, essential, but they're not the complete solution for AI bias. So in terms of the discussion about this, chief ethics, I mean, for example, at IBM, of course, in terms of ethics, not AI ethics, but ethics in general, there is a corporate responsibility, a whole team and the whole division in charge of corporate responsibility. And I am the AI ethics global leader of IBM. But for example, we thought that one person appointed was not enough, really. So that's why we built this board that has representatives from every division of the company, research, business, the services, the health, even marketing, communication, government relationship. So all the different divisions, and it's co-chaired by me and the chief privacy officer, because of course, as you was mentioned, privacy is also very important. And these people, members of the board, are not just any people in those divisions, are the people that have the power to implement in their division what has been decided by the board. And this was not always like that. At the beginning, the board did not have that power. So we restructured over time, because we figured out that, yes, a board without that power is an interesting place to discuss, but not really what we needed. And so we needed to have people with the decision to go back home in their division and implement what the board decides. So one person is not enough. It really needs all of these people together that can really change the culture for incentives, like developers. If they spend time doing bias detection and mitigation, are they evaluated positively for that or negatively? Because maybe the service that they're going to produce, they're going to develop, it takes a little bit more time to be developed, right? So it's a whole, many dimensions that need to be considered. And what we always say that, of course, this AI ethics, whether it's bias or anything else, it's not really about compliance. It's about, saying what is important for us. And again, it doesn't, not everything comes from in a proactive way, but most of it comes. But there are also the clients that ask, what are you doing about AI bias? What are you doing about explainability? What are you doing about this AI decision? So the pressure, I don't think only for IBM, but I think in general comes also from the clients. And so there is something that, yes, of course, if there is a law, any company has to be compliant to the law, but there is something in AI ethics that goes beyond that, and that can also have businesses understand that it can create actually a competitive advantage to go beyond what the law requires, right? Because everybody has to comply with the law, but if you go beyond that with some motivation because of values, because of something, then this is something that can create a difference for that company as well, besides being something that you think is good to do.
Good points, thank you. Go ahead, Kirsten.
I agree. I think where this occurs in an organization is important. And let me just say what the ideal is. The ideal is that a computer scientist understands what her job is to create a program or an augmented decision that is ethical, where she's taken into consideration the harms, the impact of marginalized communities. some sort of feedback mechanism where someone's able to govern this so that they understand what happens over time. And this is all baked into what it means to be the identity of being a computer scientist. That's the ideal place for these decisions to be made, because the best way organizations have been dealing with ethical behavior for forever, whether everyone on the outside thinks they're doing it well or not. And the best way it is that when you define a leader, for example, or who we promote, that it's not an outside organization with this chief ethics officer or the chief trust officer or chief privacy officer deciding what a good leader is. Everyone agrees that a good leader includes being fair, treating people with dignity, kind of being open and honest. Like, that's just baked into it. So that's the best place where this can occur. And I think the more work that we do to argue that I'm going to borrow a phrase from a philosopher of science named Richard Rudner, and his argument was, a computer scientist, as a computer scientist, makes value judgments, and they're making ethical decisions as they do their day-to-day work. And it's important that we make sure that that's regulated, not in a legal sense, but that they're looking over and making cognizant ethical decisions, that they understand what they do has import. So that's the best case scenario. And I think that that should be our ideal when we get there. Unfortunately, I don't think that most organizations see their computer scientists as making value judgments. And we still hear work even from academic computer scientists who say things like, this wasn't really the algorithm's fault. It really wasn't the computer scientist. It was really just how it was used in the wild and all that type of stuff. And so everyone knows what I'm talking about. So that's the problem, that we're just not there yet. So even though I don't agree with like a single federal law, as waiting for a single federal law to solve all these problems, I will argue, counter to most of my business school compatriots here, that I think it's going to happen in the courts. And I think that's the way the businesses are going to actually be held responsible, that it's going to be through suing someone over an insurance claim, suing someone over an employment decision, suing someone that's actually using the current laws that we have on the books. Is going to how they're all of a sudden organizations are going to have to wake up and realize that these computer scientists they've hired are making important decisions that actually impact their liability in the field. And so that's the outside market force that's going to force organizations to do things. We usually think of market forces, the way we get organizations to do stuff outside of regulation, is consumers, labor, so developers not going to work for them, which has started, and stockholders, so through the SEC. Those are kind of my big three mechanisms to pull on an organization. I don't see those. I don't think they care about the labor market as much as we would think they do, that the great computer scientists with a PhD in computer science are not going to Facebook. I think they can just get the second best and they're fine with that. And so I think that the court system is how we're going to get them to that ideal state that I mentioned, which is my ideal. And that's my guess is the mechanism, but I'm not. That would be what I would say might happen next.
Great, thank you all. I think we've got a minute or two left before I have to hand it back over to Mark to wrap us up. Any final thoughts from any of the panelists? Kathy, something from you?
Yeah, really quickly to Kirsten's comments just now, as a algorithmic auditor, I get a lot of interest from senior data scientists in regulated companies, and the first phone call goes really well, where they're like, yeah, I'm really afraid that like I'm embedding historical racism or whatever in my algorithms, and I would like to know if that's really true. Can you help me? And I'm like, yes, that's what I do. And then the second call, when we're trying to dig deeper, the general counsel is on the line, and the general counsel says, why should we do this? What if you find a problem that we don't know how to fix? Then we have lost our plausible deniability. We don't want to be the next cigarette company.
Right.
And at that moment, I'm always like, yes, I do need more leverage to convince people to do the right thing. And that will come in the form of either lawsuits, class action lawsuits, plaintiff lawsuits, or regulators finally getting their act together. But I think it has to be a combination. Like, regulators aren't going to do it until they see lawsuits. So right. I agree with Kirsten on that.
All right, with that, I think we'll wrap up this panel. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions, sharing your thoughts with us. This was wonderful. And Mark, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks all of you. That was a great panel. Being the lawyer in the room, having been invoked a number of times there, I just want to also say, though, that so I think there's actually one of the things that I tell my students a lot is, the best legal advice is often to do the right thing, because the legal and business interests actually will ultimately align here. So if Kirsten is right that what's coming in the future is legal accountability, then the best legal advice you can possibly give to a company is actually to get your house in order before that comes your way, right? So you don't have to experience it. So I think there is actually an opportunity to align business and legal interests here in a way that actually gets us the right result. And I hope that the lawyers listening will take that seriously. All right, so my job here really just to wrap up, to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks to all the great panelists for doing this. If you like, those of you who are tuning in, if you liked what you heard, visit our website at techethics.nd.edu, join our mailing list so you know about future events. Hopefully we'll get to work with the ThinkND folks again in the future. Thanks to the Notre Dame Studios folks for helping put it together, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Take care.